Well, welcome to the show today. I'm very excited. I feel like this best-selling author, is my little sister. I've read her book. It's just an incredible book. If you deal with grief, and all of us will at one time or another, but this is a fantastic book. It's called A Hole in the World. It's Amanda Opelt. I'll put this book in the description box, but if you're not dealing with grief, at some point in time, you certainly will. And Amanda, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Ken, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for reading the book.
Oh man, I tell you, it's a book that I'll keep in my library, but I will be buying more copies and giving copies away to family and friends for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How'd you grow up and background?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, born and raised a Alabama football fan. My dad went to University of Alabama for one of his many degrees that he had. I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were both gracious, loving, strong believers, and I think one of the great privileges of my growing up years was that my parents always had us in really healthy, loving, gracious churches. And I know a lot of young people my age, I say young people, I'm really not that young anymore. I'm pushing 40 now. But a lot of people of my generation, millennials, I know we still think of millennials as being kind of young, but we're edging on middle age. But a lot of people my age had a tough experience in the church, hurt, abuse or mistreatment from pastors or shepherds, and have left the faith as a result. And I've just always felt really privileged that I had such a healthy experience growing up in the church, loving people, loving parents. Had a big sister named Rachel that I looked up to, and I was kind of her shadow. We were really close, about 2.5 years apart. Moved to East Tennessee. My dad was in Christian education, and so we moved there for his job. And I've pretty much lived in the South my whole life, though I've spent some time overseas. After college, went to Christian college. After college, spent some time doing missions work in India. Then went into the social service sector. Worked in nonprofit in Nashville for a few years, working with economically under-resourced women in the urban center there in Nashville, and then eventually moved to kind of what has felt like the longer point of my career, which is humanitarian aid work. Now, I was never a proper aid worker. I was not the person delivering the food and writing the grants for disaster victims, but I worked in staff care and chaplaincy for international aid workers. And so I got to kind of go all over the world and meet with long-term aid workers and help them kind of process through their trauma and develop skills for resilience to do that kind of work. And that's what my husband does. My husband and I have been married about 12 years. And well, actually, it might be 13. I'm not really sure, 12 or 13 years. And he still works in that arena. And we've got two little girls, a toddler and a 4-year-old. And now we live in the mountains of Boone, North Carolina. And I really wasn't planning on ever becoming an author. That was not really my aim or my goal in life. I thought I'd kind of do aid work or something thereabouts my whole life. But it was my sister who encouraged me to start writing. She was a critically acclaimed, very successful Christian author who wrote about faith and deconstruction and learning to love Jesus again when your faith changes. And she encouraged me to write, but I just never thought that the first book I would write would be a book about the grief I experienced when she died. She died very suddenly at the age of 37, and got the flu, standard flu, thought she would, rest up a few days and get better. But after a tough battle with the flu, she began experiencing brain seizures that the doctors couldn't explain and couldn't get under control. And eventually, after about 3 weeks in the ICU, her brain began to swell and and she passed away. And this was just an unthinkable turn of events for me and my family's life, and certainly challenged my faith. And so processing her loss and thinking about what how we process grief as a society now is what really led to the writing of this book.
Yes. Well, when you were doing aid work in these different countries, I think you were 21 years old, and it was really, you were seeing firsthand death,
Mm,
malnutrition, and I remember a story where you were in India and a mother and a child came to you, um, and you were able to actually, y'all sent them away for a need or something. So, yeah, you've definitely experienced a lot. But if you don't mind, talk a little bit about. I know, of course, your sister was just tragic. I lost a brother a couple of years ago to cancer, and
so
but
sorry.
talk to us. I know that there was your grandmother as
Mhm.
well. You were in the Congo, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting because I really can say that up to a certain point, my life had just been so I see now that it was unusually free of loss, trauma. um I had had a pretty easy life up until a certain point. We've been healthy, we'd had everything we needed. We weren't rich, but we had everything that we needed. And so I'd traveled all these other parts of the world and seen suffering really firsthand. And people who had lost everything in disasters or warfare, famine, seeing children dying of HIV, all of these things that I had borne witness to. And so I kind of thought I'd be prepared when grief came to my doorstep. I thought I was kind of an expert.
Right.
But it's different when it's your loved ones. It's different when it's your life and you can't take a plane ride home to get out of it. And so yeah, it was about 5 years ago now when this kind of series of losses started to unfold in my life. And it really began with the death of my grandmother, who I was pretty close to. She lived nearby here in the mountains of North Carolina. She was older, but she'd been really, really healthy and took a really sudden turn in her health. And I was actually on a trip yet with my job. I was just about to literally board a little hopper flight from Entebbe, Uganda, into the middle of nowhere in Congo, where our team was. And I just couldn't get home in time for the funeral. And so I proceeded with the trip, and never really, because I missed that ritual of the funeral, that kind of process of grieving with my family. It took me a while I think to kind of reach. I don't like the word closure because I really don't think there's ever closure with death. I don't think you close things out and tick the box, but I really didn't know how to integrate the loss into my life. And then shortly after that, I spent some time, probably my hardest deployment in my um, international work, which was in Mosul, Iraq, during kind of the war that was going on between Iraqi forces and coalition forces and ISIS, and just really saw probably the worst traumatic forms of suffering I've ever seen, kind of in this combat hospital that our organization, Samaritan's Purse, had set up just outside the hospital. And then after that, I lost two pregnancies, or three pregnancies, really, over the course of 2 or 3 years after a season of infertility. And so just all of those things kind of back to back capped off with what was the most catastrophic, surprising, unforeseen loss of all, which was my sister. And that's when I took a step back and said, I've got to understand what's going on in my heart and my mind. I got to understand how this is going to impact my faith, my life, my emotions going forward, because this has been a lot.
Yeah. So that was what triggered you starting to do some research. You were actually just trying to grieve yourself and
Yeah.
get through the process of the loss. And so you started doing some research about all this. I think something popped up on your phone that your phone knows you better than we do.
It's true. It's interesting how, like, it this book would not exist were it not for those darn algorithms on our phone that somehow know what we're going through and can hear us. I don't know, they can hear us thinking, I guess. And it knew I
They,
was grieving, and it brought up on, I must have been my Facebook feed, an article about strange and unusual grief rituals from the past and from around the world. And that's what led me down this journey of understanding how other generations and other people have learned to grieve and process their losses.
let's talk about some of those rituals.
Yeah. Well, some of them are a little strange.
Yeah.
There are rituals and there are more formal rituals, and then there are superstitions. So I wrote about some of the superstitions in the book. Superstitions like covering mirrors when someone dies, and there were lots of reasons people. It's interesting. It's a pretty ubiquitous tradition, and it's all around the world and for different reasons. It's practiced in the Middle East. It's practiced in Creole cultures. It's practiced in European cultures and Jewish cultures. And for the Jewish people, what I learned is that many of the some Jewish mystics believed that the demons were particularly present when death had come to the home. And so if you were to look in the mirror too obsessively, then those demons would affix themselves to your soul. Other more kind of traditional, typical Jewish belief is that you should cover the mirrors because a person shouldn't be fixated on their appearance when they're grieving. They shouldn't worry about how a mess their hair is and how swollen their eyes are from crying. They should just be able to be fully present in the grief. Traditions in Europe say you cover the mirrors because if you see your reflection in the mirror after someone has died, you'll be the next to die. Another kind of superstition I talked about was telling the bees, which was the belief that if you had beehives and you didn't tell the bees when someone died, then they would fly away and that you would lose your livelihood because of it. And this one was of particular interest to me because my husband's a beekeeper. We actually have beehives. We did not tell our bees at the time that all this happened. And interestingly, they did fly away that year. And there's lots of reasons why they could have. But these superstitions are interesting to me because I'm not a superstitious person. I'm a person that kind of believes in God's sovereign presence over the universe. But what I think these superstitions speak to is the very palpable fear that we experience in the wake of death. And this, death is really, for most of human history, has been quite a mystery. In America and 21st century, we can name a cause of death. We can do autopsy. We have germ theory. We tend to know why people die. But 100 years ago and before, there were many times you had no idea why someone had died. And so this mystery and this unknown realm of this precipice between life and death conjured a lot of fear in people. And so sometimes a superstition was just, to me, an act of agency, like the one thing you can do to kind of try to control your outcomes. And so to me, I think what they taught me was that you don't have to fear the mystery as much as maybe people who didn't know God or didn't trust God, or whatever. You don't have to have that fear, but it is okay to name the reality that things are still out of your control. As much control as we think we may have in modern Western day America, as much knowledge as we have, death is still a mystery, and life is still very precarious, and it's okay to name that, and to kind of I don't know, understand that, and understand that that's what you're experiencing. The only other one I'll mention that I thought was really interesting, that to me was really the ritual that started me on the journey, was the practice of keening, with Irish keening. And keening is wailing aloud at funerals. And we see that a lot in biblical times. Again, that's another practice we see all over the world. We do not see that here in Western America, because it's kind of seen as unhinged or lacking in decorum. And so it's the Irish in the olden days, they specifically made place at the wake. They made a time at the wake where these lead keeners, these women in the community, would come and lead the whole room in this rambunctious, boisterous wail, just to kind of let people fall apart, to give them permission to fall apart. And these are just things I think that are necessary and needed in our culture today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that's really interesting. I think it says in Jeremiah, you reference that about the women Jeremiah chapter 9 that says, bring the professional wailers in, uh,
Yeah.
and even teach the daughters that the skill. And I think we view it, or I've always been taught, your book was such an eye opener to me, is, how, be tough, Ken,
Mm,
stiff upper lip, uh, you're the man, you take care of everybody. They're going to be looking to you. You stand tall. Don't
yeah.
let them see you. Don't let them see you grieve like that.
Yeah. I think a lot of people have received that message for a lot of reasons. Some of it is cultural. Um, and whereas I think the ancient Irish would look at that and say, that's actually, it's irresponsible not to grieve and to wail aloud. That it's not normal. You're actually strange if you don't fall apart, because you're not being honest with yourself and you're not being honest with your community members about how you're feeling. But I don't know if you think this, Ken. I think there's also some religious pressure within the Christian world to say, well, if your hope is truly in Christ, and if you know where you're going when you die, then you've got nothing to fear, and faith over fear, and the joy of the Lord is my strength. And so we like to fast forward really quickly to those silver linings and that redemptive story. And I actually just don't see that modeled by Jesus. I don't see it was God who told Jeremiah to bring the wailing women in,
Yeah, well,
to say we need to wail over what's happened to Israel and the losses that they've faced. It's a prophetic act. Lament. 1/3 of the Psalms are lament psalms.
yes, they are.
And even Jesus, if you look at Jesus, he lost it in the Garden of Gethsemane. Had it almost like, I heard it described recently as a panic attack, and that actually was kind of comforting to me to say, even Jesus, who was God, who knew fully the joy set before him, who knew why he was going to the cross, who had a well constructed theology of suffering, I would say Jesus did. Even Jesus completely broke down in the Garden of Gethsemane from his sorrow and his dread of what was to come. And even on the cross, what did Jesus say? He didn't say faith over fear. He didn't say it is well with my soul. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I think there's something to learn there, that even our God modeled what it was to break down and be overcome by sadness from time to time. And so we are given full permission to do that, I believe.
Sure. I mean, yeah. In Isaiah 53, it talks about Jesus was a man of sorrows,
Yeah.
acquainted with grief. And then you go further down, it's perplexing to me. And it says, it pleased God to afflict him,
Yes.
you know. So it's pretty strong there. But I think the church has it. I think, if I remember correctly, in the Irish keening, it was actually the church that tried to kind of stomp that out.
Yeah. And I have such mixed feelings about this, right? Because in many cases, we do see that it was the church that tried to shut down some of these grief rituals. Sometimes it was because they felt like there was pagan undertones to some of the practices. Sometimes it was because the theology didn't match up. Tolling the bell is another ritual I write about in the book. Is that it used to be in old Europe, they would toll the bell for when someone was dying, as a call to prayer for the person who was dying, and then they would toll the bell after the person died as a call to pray for the soul of the dying. And so the reformers came along and said, well, we don't believe in praying for the dead, so we're going to shut down this ritual because it's the theology's bad. And I can understand that. But there's if you're going to take a ritual away, you need to replace it. If you're going to tell the Irish keeners they can't wail because they feel like it's not there's no decorum, then you need to find another outlet for people's grief. And so I can't decide, like kind of doing a survey of history, I can't decide if the church is a protector of rituals or a destroyer of rituals. Because if you think about it, like tomorrow, I'm going to an Ash Wednesday service. And that is a ritual of grief. It is a ritual of reflecting on the death of Christ, the impact of your own sin, your own mortality. And the church is preserving these moments of reflection and confrontation with our grief and our mortality, and that's really important. But in other ways, they've kind of dismantled some rituals, and so I don't know. I'd leave it to the truly academic historians to make a judgment call on whether or not the church has helped or hurt on this front. But I think it's a little bit of both.
I think you're right. And I think that along those lines, I've been to some recently where there's kind of been a shift because, okay, you believe in the resurrection, they're in a better place, just they're looking down from heaven, all is well, hallelujah.
Yeah.
That in many people now, they don't even call it a funeral, it's called a celebration of life. And
Yes.
you have these people, that are obviously grieving, but it's like a celebration, and I one particular one, I wanted to go up to the man and just give him a hug, and tell him I loved him, and I know that.
And that's hard. I never want to pass judgment on any particular family's way of coping with their grief. And if this is how people cope by calling it a separate celebration of life instead, then that's really their call. But at the same time, I do wonder sometimes if we just have, I mean, if you look at funerals from the past, they were somber. Everyone was dressed in black. The music was um, intense and dark, and it was meant to be a time of like really marinating in your sadness, and really allowing that sadness to do its work in you. And now there's some kind of aversion that we have to uncomfortable feelings in our culture that I really think is worth paying attention to. Like, why is it that we have such a hard time being sad and being angry, or being uh uh having doubt? There's no space for doubt in the life of faith anymore, because we just don't know how to deal with uncomfortable feelings, I think.
I like what you said. Give yourself permission to get lost in the landscape of grief.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's you need to walk in that wilderness, I think. Like, I mean, God allowed the Israelites to walk in that wilderness for 40 years, and sometimes we need to spend some time in that place of not knowing, in that place of not arriving to the happy endings, in the place of despair, because I think God actually has some important things to teach us in those spaces.
yes. One of the other things that really struck me too is we like to, in our funerals or life celebrations or whatever we want to call them, is it's like, you have a 2 hours here.
Hmm.
We're going to come visit you for 2 hours.
Yep. Yep.
And then the funeral, two, if we're pushing it, we might get three.
Yeah.
But a
Yeah.
lot of these traditions, and some of them do have some really good things I think we can learn from. They lasted a week.
Yeah. Well,
This,
yeah. I mean, my Jewish friend Shelley, who grew up in Israel, lost her mother and her sister in a car accident when she was 21, I believe, and just so her experience of what it was like to grieve as a person in that culture taught me so much, because it was a full week of mourners just sitting at home, not having to take care of anything. People coming to bring them their food, clean their house, and visit over the course of a week. And then the grieving time is extended beyond that, even, where they're kind of given permission to just not be fully themselves for 6 months or a year, depending on who it is that dies. And it's not to say that the year mark means that you've crossed the finish line and you're done grieving. It just means that you're given a full year to say, this is what I'm doing right now, this is what I'm paying attention to, this is what my life is oriented around, is this loss and processing this loss and figuring out how to move forward. I think that's really important.
hmm and really, after these situations, death, loss, you never really go back to normal after an event like this.
You don't. You really don't. And that's why, I mean, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, The Five Stages of Grief. We're all fairly familiar with that, and people are starting to kind of reject that notion that there are five stages that you cleanly move through and tick off the box. I think in some ways, poor Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I think she was really just trying to give us a few ideas of the different emotions that we might have when faced with mortality. But you're right. You may feel that you have really integrated the loss and learned and moved on, and then something will happen that will send you headlong back into what feels like ground zero of your loss, and you start over again. And I think grieving is not grieving well, doing the grief work, as people call it, is not closure and moving on. I think it's learning. It's not getting over the loss. It's learning to carry the loss, because I think the sadness never goes away. You just develop the muscles to carry it going forward. And that's what I wish people knew about grief more than anything.
Hmm. Let's talk for a moment, if you don't mind, about Decoration Day.
Oh, I love Decoration Day. Mostly because I've always lived in Greater Appalachia. My family's lived in the Appalachian Mountains on my mom's side since the 1700s. So Decoration Day is a practice that it's still actually practiced today, although it's slowly dying out. And it's this practice of every year, um, decorating the graves in the family graveyard or the church graveyard. Now, when I wrote about Decoration Day, my editor, it was one of the only major changes she needed me to make to the book, because I said, "Oh yeah, you decorate family graveyards," and she was like, "Family graveyards? Like, what are you talking about?" Like, she lives in New York. She was like, cemeteries are like those big things outside the city where we bury people. And I'm like, oh no, they're all over in the mountains. Like, there's 5 doors down this way is a small graveyard with graves from the 1800s, and 2 doors down that way is a church graveyard. There, we just bury people everywhere around here on the family land, up on the hillsides. And so, these graveyards, every year, there's one day designated for each graveyard, and it's usually sometime between May and October. Most decoration days take place late in the summer or in the fall, after the harvest has been brought in and people have more free time. But the whole kind of family network or community would come to the graveyard and have just a day together where they would remember all of their lost loved ones together. So it wasn't necessarily to honor just one person or one grave. They would clean off all the graves. They would put flowers on all of the graves. And it was a day of singing. They would sing songs together. They would pray together. They would share stories. They would cry. They would honor their loved ones, and then they would eat together and share a meal. And it was kind of meant to be a time of reconnection for extended family and kinfolk, but also just a time of every year you remember what this person meant to you, what these people meant to you, and almost honoring your ancestors and the legacy that your family had. And what's really interesting is this practice, it's practiced in Appalachia and the lower South region. And it's also incidentally practiced in Liberia, of all places. And a quick check of your history books will tell you that Liberia was a place when they kind of tried this experiment of sending freed slaves back to West Africa. They gave them this designated country of Liberia to go to. And I'm not qualified enough to say whether or not that was a failed experiment or a good idea. But these freed slaves took the practice of Decoration Day from the Appalachian region back to Liberia. And I have lots of friends in Liberia, Liberian friends, and they still do it. In fact, it's a bigger holiday there than it is in Appalachia. It's one day out of the year, and they clean the graves and they talk to their loved ones and they share with their loved ones all the things that happened during the year after they died and the years since they died. And it's just this really beautiful practice.
Yeah, that goes on here in East Texas.
Does it?
Yeah, the first time I went, I think I was just dating my wife. We've been married 32 years, but I thought, what in the world are these people doing? We're going out to a graveyard.
Yeah.
We have all this food. There's going to be a message. They're singing songs. I thought this is really weird, but they actually it just I've grown to love it now.
Yeah.
I could walk over. They had these long cement. I mean, these founders of this association cemetery had the foresight. They built these huge, long, like 40 yards long cement tables into the ground and
Wow.
still standing. So we've got our food set up here, but we have permission. We could come to Amanda's down over on this other long, and I would pick some food up. Say you have blueberries or cobbler pie or whatever, and we would
Yeah.
everybody just mills around and shares food together, and it really is. It's a time to where people feel good about it.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It is practiced in some of these rural areas in the South still. And my aunt started when we moved up to Boone, my aunt started inviting me. Our family graveyard's about an hour south, and she's like, "You got to start coming to the decoration. Come to decoration." I was young then. I was like, "What is she talking about? I don't need to go to that." And I realize now I was part of a ritual, the death of a ritual, because now they don't do it as much because there's not enough people that show up to it. And I'm like, I should have shown up. I should have been part of like carrying it on to the next generation. So we're trying to kind of bring it back and to some of these areas where it's starting to stop being practiced. But it's such an important part of our culture and part of our collective grieving.
Yeah, I think the same thing in the one that my wife is involved in. The older people are the ones that are participating and they're dying off.
Yes,
The
yes.
younger people do not seem to have the interest or the time to want to participate in it. So it's really it's heartbreaking for those who have kept the cemetery up and made sure everything is maintained, mowed, the grounds, the tombstones are washed, and so forth like that. But every year they have a little a meeting and it's discussed. How can we get the younger generation involved in this?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, to be honest with you, Ken, like that's part of why I wrote my book. And if I could leave any hope, it would be that young people would continue some of these practices and that they would pick them up and say it's the older generation is something to teach us here, that we have something to learn from the older generation. And let's look up from our phones and start looking at one another and looking around us and saying, what are these embodied practices that we can do to actually process our loss?
I think so many people, and myself included, we feel uncomfortable sometimes approaching if it's the spouse that's survived and so forth. And I know you mentioned about Job's three, I guess you call Job's three friends.
Yeah.
Um, but I like what you said. Just share your thoughts on that about just being present and
Yeah.
helping.
Yeah. Well, Shelley told me that in the practice of sitting Shiva, the Jewish people look to the friends of Job on how not to behave at in although they started out well and sitting in silence for a while, and then very quickly they felt a need to kind of want to explain why all this had happened. And I think that's human nature, right? When we have an encounter with intense extreme loss, it provokes us
Mm,
to ask questions. Why? We want to know why. We want
mm.
to know the purpose. And maybe it's because we want to try to get out ahead of the next thing and change course, or what do we need to do to make sure this never happens again? And I think the ultimate message of Job is kind of God saying, we you won't always know why, but I am here and I am God. Job never know that it was actually his suffering was a result of this diabolical dare. Like Satan going to God and saying, I bet you your man Job won't stick with you if you send suffering. And God said, well, let's try him. Like Job never had that curtain pulled back. He never saw the reason for his suffering. And in the end, he accepted it anyway. And I think that's kind of the message, is like, we just can't know. We can't always know why. And so when you're sitting with people who are grieving, You don't need to give them a reason why this happened. You don't need to give them the redemptive silver lining, the kind of trite platitudes of everything happens for a reason, and aren't you glad they're in a better place, and well, maybe God's just going to teach you so much through this. It's not that some of those things aren't true. It's that they're not helpful in that moment. It's that that's not what that person needs to hear to really process what they're going through. And sometimes silence is the best way to be with a person who's grieving. I think the biggest thing I learned, I think, from sitting Shiva is that their belief is that you need to mirror what the mourner is doing.
Mm.
And so if you go to visit someone who's grieving a death of a loved one, if they're laughing and sharing stories, then you should laugh and share stories. And if they're sitting silently, then you can sit silently. If they're crying, then you should cry. I'll never, when I was grieving, I know there were times where it was like, okay, I feel like laughing right now, because mourners are still human. We still want to laugh and we still want to. And then someone came to me and felt like they needed to just cry and weep with me to show me how upset they were for me. And I was like, I was actually finally in the mood for cry for laughing. So can we just laugh together? So mirroring what the mourner is doing. It's hard to remember what to say, what not to say. That's exhausting. But I can remember a mirror. I can remember the image of, okay, I need to just fall in step with what this person is exhibiting right now and be that for them right now.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I think it's interesting too that I think most theologians would agree that the first book that God gave us was Job.
Yeah. It's why, yeah, they believe that it was kind of the first oral tradition that was then documented and handed down. And so if we look at like, wow, what an amazing choice on God's part, that like he could have his first God breathed words that he gave in this tradition of scripture to us could have been, I'm amazing, and you're small, and you're like whatever, fall in line. It's like, no, it was, pain is real. It's part of the human experience. I see it, and I'm here, and I'm God. Like that to me is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it is. Um, Jumping back to your first uh, miscarriage, I thought it was just really profound. I think you rolled over in bed and you asked your husband, Tim, what do you want to do today?
Yeah.
And I just
It-
loved his response. Let's go pick blueberries.
Yeah, I think anyone who's experienced a loss like that, it's a strange experience, because you're not grieving someone you know, you're grieving someone you hope to know. It's the loss of a dream, and you feel a little bit as the woman going through it, like your body's failed, like you couldn't, this kind of false belief that you couldn't take care of this little life inside of you, that your body didn't do what it was supposed to do.
Mm,
And I think Tim knew that the best thing for us to do was just to get out and move and be in nature and eat. Like, let's feed your body something good. um, and let your body heal too, because I think that's something that we sometimes forget, is that when we grieve, our whole bodies are grieving. And that's why there's such high rates of like heart attack and chronic illness that ensues after people lose a loved one, as they too become ill, because our bodies are absorbing what we're experiencing in our hearts and in our heads. We're whole beings, we're not just
mhm,
brains living in bodies. Our brains are part of our bodies, our hearts are part of our bodies, our emotions are integrated with our physical reality. And so I think Tim intuitively knew that and said, let's get you moving. Let's go walk. We'll go pick blueberries. We'll go, drive through the countryside, see the mountains, breathe some fresh air. And that's what you need right now. And it was exactly what I needed.
mhm. And I think a lot like you discuss about food
Mm-hmm.
and every one of the rituals or that there, food was such an important element of every one that you researched.
Yeah, it's, we tend to, honestly, that's one of the few rituals of grief that we've really maintained well over the years. And, it's like, and I guess it's because everybody's got to eat, but like, that was really, really beautiful. Is like when people don't, when somebody loses someone, no one knows what to do other than deliver the casseroles. Like, well, we got to feed the mourners, And so what was great about that when my sister died was that it just meant that, hour by hour, we kept having these, little gentle knocks on the door,
Mm.
and people just saying, here, take this, here's a cake, here's, a plate of cold cuts and cheese for sandwiches. Here's a lasagna. And they didn't intrude and they didn't stay for long, but they were able to look me in the eye and say, we love you, we're praying for you, here's some food. And it was really just beautiful. What I love about some of the more ritualistic food practices is there's some symbolism and meaning in some of these traditional food and grief practices. I love the practice of making kolava in Greek cultures, which is this special dish made especially at a time of grieving. That it's a dish that has a bunch of different types of seeds and fruits mixed into it, and it's symbolic because it's meant to kind of symbolize the fact that a person's life is really like a seed in our soul. And as we ingest that seed and we're around that person and we're influenced by that person, when they die, they bud and bloom into our own life. And that the characteristics that we observe and the character qualities that we absorb from these other people that we love manifest in our own life. And that's what the dish of kolava represents. And I just think that that's a really beautiful image.
When you started experiencing all these losses, and um, how did that change your faith, or your faith begin to process? Because you grew up, you had this ideal, kind of a little bit like I
Yeah,
meant. Well,
totally.
I
Yeah.
felt, I felt like now I was in a little bit of a bubble.
Yeah.
I thought, this is what happens to other people. This is not going to happen to Ken.
Yeah.
That happens to my neighbors or to other people. Um,
Yeah.
so
I had that belief too, that like the grief is something that happens to other people, or like the beneficiaries that I visit in my work, and it's not me, it's not my life. I think the way it impacted my faith was just kind of realizing how kind of maybe insufficient some of my practices had been in really accepting the pain that's in the world. And when I first went to the Bible when I was grieving, I was maybe upset with God. I was
sure,
frustrated, and why had he let this happen? But I think the way that it enhanced my faith is that once I then read through the Bible, pretty shortly after Rachel died, I decided to read through the Bible kind of as quickly as I could, because I kind of wanted to get it all in one big fire hose, because
yeah,
I was kind of relearning how to believe in God, I think, after that.
sure,
And to read through the Bible with through the eyes of a mourner, I found so much more richness. It was almost like this book had been written. It's been written to mourners. That's the whole purpose. It's written to grievers, and because we all are grievers as humans. And I saw how God was a griever. I think I just had my whole life of faith. I'd been given this kind of message, not necessarily from my parents, but maybe from kind of the larger evangelical culture or other preachers,
yeah.
that emotions were not to be trusted, and that emotions would lead you astray. And I encountered so much emotion in scripture after I read through it as a griever, not just from humans, but God. Like, God has a lot of emotions in scripture. Like, he's angry, he's jealous, he has moments where he regrets making mankind because of the pain that they've caused him. He is sacrificial. He knows what it is to lose a son. He knows what it is to lose relationship with the children that he loves. And God is also joyful and celebratory and filled with love, it's an anguished love that we see God has for humanity. And I just never saw that, because I had been kind of taught not to see emotion or something, or not to trust it. and to see the dynamic nature of God now that I was a griever and I was experiencing all these highs and lows was a really had a really profound impact on my faith.
Yeah, that's great. I've seen so many people, especially during the recent COVID situation, that I don't know if I don't, but I've seen people quite the opposite, where they walked away from their faith,
Yeah.
the loss, the anger, being angry at um, God, for how could God allow this to happen? You took someone I loved in the prime of their life, or I
Yeah.
lost my child, you know, but so praise God that you came through it that way. That's wonderful. I kind of feel like the disciples, Lord, where are we gonna go? you know,
Yeah. I
it's
mean, I definitely have that experience. I'm not going to say my faith is always free of doubt, and that always every single morning I wake up feeling really confident that this is true. That some mornings I wonder, and some mornings I have questions and doubts. But I feel like there's something about the person of Christ and the God of the Bible that illuminates the reality of the world, that explains so much, that offers me a way of being that feels right and good and true. And I find it to be trustworthy. And so I'm going to be walking on this path until somebody convinces me otherwise, I guess, is that I'm going to be walking in faith in Christ, and um, trust that he's the way, and that to follow him is the way. And I so far, even though I have my doubts, I can't say that walking in the way of Jesus has ever let me down. It's never let me down. And it's never, and I don't mean it's never made me sad or that it's always been easy. I just mean that it has led to a life that feels rooted in truth and grace and goodness.
I have a friend. He reminds me often, not that it's easy, but one of his favorite sayings is, and he's been through a lot, is God does his best work in my worst times.
Mm, yeah, it's true. I had a friend after my sister died, and she's very gentle about it. She's like, I don't know if you're ready to hear this or if this will be helpful, but someone said to me when my mom died, cherish the moments of your grief, for God is close to the brokenhearted.
Mm,
And it's really true. It's not a silver lining, it's both. And it's the
yeah.
goodness of the presence of God in your grief doesn't negate the grief or make it go away. It just exists alongside it in a way that's really beautiful.
Mhm. And I like what you said, the greater the love, the greater the loss, and the greater the grief.
Mm.
And I see some people that have lost someone, a spouse, loved one, whatever, and it's like they put this protective, I don't want to love again. I don't want to put myself out there. I don't want to connect with all these people. And so they kind of live their lives, withdrawn and not full of passion.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's like when we think about trying to hold it together, like you said, when you lose someone you love, to me, in some ways, that does a disservice to the person that you love. That if I'm falling apart and wailing and disoriented by my sister's loss, it that's honestly just a testament
Yeah.
to the impact and the gravity of her love in my life. And I will continue to name that and say who she was, and how much her life meant to me. Um, and that's why I'm wailing, that's why I'm upset, that's why I'm despondent, that's why I feel hopeless sometimes, is because she was wonderful, and the love we shared was beautiful, and it's gone. It's not gone, it's still here, but it looks completely different now, and I'm grieving that. And so I think, but the profoundness of our grief is just a testament to the profoundness of our love that we shared.
The things I thought is interesting too is all of these rituals, they were done in community.
Mm-hmm.
they were done communally, and I think now we've kind of gotten away that from that.
Yeah, I mean, historically, we've moved as a society away from these communal life rhythms of working the land together and more agrarian subsistence type of societies to nuclear families. Most people live away from family. They've moved to other cities for jobs, for work. And so the emphasis is either on the nuclear family living kind of shut away in a home together, or on just the individual. And even within nuclear families, there's so much emphasis on just the individual, and you need to tend to your own grief. And so we pay therapists to listen to us process our grief, because maybe there's no one around us that can live through it with us and walk the journey with us. And I'm not against therapy. In fact, I've got an appointment with my therapist after this. I still talk to a grief counselor every few weeks just to kind of help me talk through what I'm feeling. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But I have found that grief therapy is not enough. I need other people that have walked a similar path to just live life with me and talk with me and be part of my community. And that's what I see in these grief rituals, is everyone giving one another permission to fall apart and pick up the slack when you're debilitated by your grief. And we just don't have that as much in society now.
Well, I think you mentioned too, like we outsource death.
Mm-hmm.
The
That's right. I mean, it
funeral
used,
homes used to.
yeah. And again, this is another one of those things where, like, it's not a bad thing that we take people to the hospital when they're dying now, because sometimes they don't die. Sometimes the hospital is able to save their life and give them 10 more years, 20 more years. It's not a bad thing that funeral homes can take care of some of these um, more kind of practical needs in the aftermath of death. But what that means is that death is something now that takes place outside of our spaces of living. The ritual, I wrote about the ritual of death rooms. That the parlor used to be called, in some circumstances, the death room, because that's where they would display the dead person after they died. People would die in the home because physicians either weren't available, hospitals weren't around, or physicians would come to the home to treat people. And so it just meant that death was more normalized. People died in the home, their bodies were displayed in the home, the wake, the kind of funeral rituals took place in the home, and then they were buried on the church grounds or in the field across the way, where you would see them on a weekly, if not daily basis. You would see the headstone, you'd see the grave. And so it was just, death was part of life. And now death is kind of seen as this anomaly, this unusual thing that happens. And when it does happen, we need to call the professionals in to take care of it. Where it used to be family members caring for the dying, family members preparing the dead body, family members digging the grave. And again, I don't know, because in some ways it's kind of nice to be relieved of some of that stuff. And I certainly would want a medical professional taking care of my sick loved one rather than me.
Sure.
But I also think that it's made it, when death does happen to you, you're completely unprepared for it and you don't know how to handle it. And then you also think, well, if I can outsource the death and dying, maybe I can outsource my grief too. And you can't. Your grief goes with you wherever you go. Your grief invades your home, and grief becomes your roommate for the next however long. And let me tell you, they don't pay their share of the rent, but they're there, and you got to figure out how to get used to that and normalize that.
Yes. Well, Amanda, I really appreciate you. I could I could talk to you all day long. Um,
Well, I've
and,
appreciated the great questions you've asked and your interest in this, and I'm hopeful that other people will continue to show interest in how we can kind of lean into some of these historic practices to help us process our grief.
well, no doubt your books had such an impact on my life, and like I said, I'll be sharing it with colleagues and family and friends, distributing copies of it. But Thanks so much for sharing. And then as we close, I want to speak to this because you've got a new book coming out,
I
Holy,
do.
Holy Unhappiness. Give me 5 minutes or so on that.
Well, it's a book this is actually a book that I started writing first. About 5 or 6 years ago, I started talking with my sister about how, gosh, sometimes doesn't it feel like life sometimes feels like kind of a disappointment, like all the things that we were promised, all the happy emotions that we were told would follow good choices and right relationship with God. It doesn't always feel that way. Why is that? And she said, you need to write a book about this. And so I kind of started taking notes and plugging away at it. And when she died, I obviously went on a very, very deep rabbit hole in another direction and wrote a grief book instead. But I came back to this one, and it is going to be released on July 18th. And it really is just a book that kind of addresses the expectations we have of what the life of faith will feel like. Um, Many of us kind of have a healthy wariness of the prosperity gospel, this idea that God's going to make us healthy and wealthy. We say, no, no, that's not in the Bible. God's not always going to give us riches and good health. Like, people suffer, and that's normal. But we do believe that we are entitled to a sense of emotional prosperity, meaning that if I'm walking with God, then I'm going to have peace in my pain, right? And if I just find my calling, then work is always going to be really meaningful. And if I just marry a good Christian person, then marriage is going to be easy and blissful and beautiful. And it's not. Work is frustrating. Grief feels awful, even if you are walking with God. And that's not because we've done something wrong. It's because that's life. And so it's kind of a book that addresses some of those expectations we have around these different facets of our life and how God is present even in the uncomfortable feelings.
Hmm. Sounds like a bestseller to me.
Well, I don't know about that, but if you're interested in it, I'll tell you, pre-orders have an inordinate amount of impact on an author's career, so they certainly do help. So if you're interested, you can check it out and buy it pretty much wherever books are sold.
I'll put in a pre-order for 5 today.
Well, I sure appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. I mean, it's been an honor and a privilege to talk to you. You're a very special guest, and I just see God's hand all over your life. You know, the tragedy, the heartache, everything you've gone through, and to still maintain the faith that you have. It encourages me and it builds up my faith. We all go through different things, but just thanks again so much for putting it all down in a book form. And this book's very inspiring. I'd encourage everybody to get it. Don't be put off by some of these rituals that may be superstitious. There's so much wisdom and Christian biblical quotes in it that you'll be glad that you purchase this book. It will help you and it will help your loved ones as well. So God bless, and thank everybody for watching.
Thank you, Ken.